It's just delightful. Yeah. So I promise you, I feel like an evangelical about this movie. I love it so much. Yeah. And we're starting to go through our movie repertoire again. All movies about that. It's just delightful. Yeah. So I promise you, I feel like an evangelical about this movie. I love it so much.
Terrible recording me.
Yeah. Yeah, who is that talking? And we're starting to go through our movie repertoire again. Absolutely.
There's the Dharma kids. Dharma kids.
Frank's here. I'm not sorry, team. Thank you very much, by the way. Seriously, only a few people actually understand that stuff.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Glad you're here. Again, anyone who doesn't have a text, sorry. Okay. Just wanted to share my copy of the book, which my granddaughter got at.
Oh, it's an autograph.
Yeah,
It's an autograph edition.
I think so. I think so. All right. So welcome everyone. Yeah. So Gretchen, is it up on the Zoom? People can see it, right? The text? Okay. Okay. I see Brent got the book. It's wonderful, but this book is daunting. This is the first complete translation of what's called the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's in Tibetan. I mean, that's the English sort of figurative translation. It's Bardo Trodol. I don't really know what that means in Tibet, but it's not literally Tibetan Book of the Dead. But again, this commentary from the Dalai Lama is what we're going to be working on. The translator is, I think I mentioned last time, someone that I had the fortune of meeting, Gyurme Dorje. He was, I think, a professor at Columbia. Anyway, he was at Columbia, and he's now retired. American guy, Matthew Kapstein. He also translated that huge, thick, I'll bring it in sometime, Dudjom Rinpoche's History of the Nyingma Lineage. So it's this enormous thing, but Matthew Kapstein is quite a talented guy. And I found myself happily, you know, this practice and this path and all of it is so wonderful because you just never know what's going to happen, even these kind of unplanned things. So when I first went to a retreat with Lama Tarchin, again, there was no plan on that. We had this little Dharma center, and someone called us up and said, there's this Lama that's just come to the States and, really doesn't have a home. So he's going around different places, looking for students or a place. And I said, well, we don't really have a home for him. We've already been founded by someone else, but sure, he can come by. And so I remember Gretchen and I went to meet him at the train station here in Rochester, and he got off and he was dressed in Nakba, holders of mantra clothes. So he's a layperson, but an ordained position also. So the Tibetans have not only monks and nuns and then lay people, the traditional four assemblies, but they have this Nakbas, which are Nakba means holder of a mantra. So it's a tantric vows, has their own system of vows, but are not necessarily celibate at all. So that was Lama Tarchin, and he had done a very long retreat. I can't remember how many years. Do you, Gretch? Yeah, it may have been. I don't want to say. No, before. And he was a student of Dudjom Rinpoche, one of the great figures of 20th century Tibet. So four great sort of traditions within Tibet, five if you count like the Dalai Lama does, but nonetheless four certainly. And one of those is the Nyingma. It means the old school. The Nyingma traditionally had no head. It was just so completely decentralized. But after the Chinese invasion and conquest, in order to help their survival, they appointed Dudjom Rinpoche as head of the Nyingma in India. And Lama Tarchin was his student, and he was also a student of one of Dudjom Rinpoche's sons, Tinley Norbu Rinpoche, who has now passed away too. Remarkable lamas, to be sure. But anyway, Lama Tarchin gets off the train. There we are in Rochester, outside on the train platform. He's wearing all this white clothing, and he has this beautiful long hair, halfway down his back practically, it seemed. And he got off with his American wife, and she came up to talk to us, and she had the strongest Brooklyn accent you can imagine. So it was just like this wonderful kind of thing. And the first thing she says to Gretchen is, "Do you have any quell?" I've got bed bugs. Or wasn't it bed bugs that she had? And she said, "We've been staying in some pretty dicey places." Lama Tarchin's tour of America. And great Lama, but this is sort of, and for that matter, Chetsang Rinpoche. What's that? Lice. Thank you, lice. Get my medications correct. It was quell, I think. Yeah, right. But even like Chetsang Rinpoche, he was working in McDonald's in, was it LA or Texas? I can't remember. Head of one of the major lineages. So the Tibetans, and that's actually a very inspiring thing, because when you have this kind of contact, just ordinary physical contact, trying to organize stuff and all of that, you see behind the scenes, and it's all so sincere and non-phony. I'm just the type of guy that's always looking for, somehow Reverend Jim Bob's got to have a fleet of Mercedes out there somewhere. And it's just all the real deal, which is so wonderful. So Lama Tarchin eventually found a home in Spokane, Washington, and founded a little Dharma center. And then he ended up getting so much interest in students in California that eventually he moved to California, to Santa Cruz. And from Santa Cruz, a very wonderful man named Tony Leitner, who had been involved in inviting the Dalai Lama to the U.S. for the first time. Tony Leitner managed to acquire a old Korean Boy Scout camp in the mountains outside of Santa Cruz. Yeah, really beautiful. You can see the redwoods, you can see the ocean off in the distance, and mist and all sorts of wonderful things. And so he's been there, Pema Osaling, way back when I was on their board of directors, and was fortunate to go out there. So he had come to Rochester, and then lo and behold, he was offering this 1 month retreat. And so we consulted and said, okay, I guess I could go. And I went, and it was in Napa Valley on raw land outside of Napa, California, and just land that was owned by another Lama. And it was just 2 yurts, one yurt that was the Lama's, just empty floor with one telephone wire going in there, one telephone in the middle of this empty yurt. Yes, way before cell phones. This is 87, I think. Then another yurt where everyone was going to practice, and but completely raw land. And so I was in this anyway, going from, I guess, the bus station, wherever they picked us up, in this pickup truck, driving and sitting in the back of this pickup. And the person I was sitting next to was Matthew Capstein, who I didn't even know at the time. So we had a wonderful talk, because I told him basically a similar story that I did just now about the need for quell, because he's American, knew the kind of crazy scene that the llamas could find themselves in. And anyway, that's that. All right, but now I can't stop, because there was one other story from that time. So we were practicing for, it was a month-long retreat. It was broken up into, I think it was 2 weeks of Vajrakalaya, maybe 10 days of Vajrakalaya, and the rest was Nundro. And in between, they had a break for laundry and things. So we collected everyone's laundry, and we were going to drive it into Napa, California, and use a laundromat machines and that, and then bring it back. So I found myself in the back of the truck with a whole bunch of laundry bags, just me and the laundry bags. And the woman who was driving the truck, sometimes after an extended period of meditation, it's like you kind of slow down in a way. And I don't know if it was her natural habit, but she was driving really slow on these really curvy, mountain roads in outside of Napa. And I'm sitting in the back of the truck, and she's just driving like this. And suddenly there's this muscle car that shows up behind us. And it looks like, like teenage guys, and they're trying to pass her, but every time they go out, they can't do it, so they keep coming back, and they're getting frustrated, and they're right behind us, right on our tail. Keep trying. I'm just watching all this. And then suddenly there's an opening, and they just go roaring by. And as they started to roar by, one guy gave me the finger. And after 10 days of Vajrakalaya, my natural reaction, I don't have any kind of bodhicitta. But my natural reaction is I just looked at him, and there was something, it was just the phenomenon of it was so wonderful that I just waved to them like this, but it was sincere. It wasn't like snarky, like, I'm going to wave at you and piss you off. You're not bothering me. It was nothing like that. It was absolutely genuine, just waving. And the guy was going, he waved back at me. Yes, he did. Well, it was outside the Napa Valley. Yeah, I don't know where. I could find it. Atiling is the name of the place. Yeah. But to me, it was such a lesson of the power of true compassion. Not the stuff that we call compassion and label, and basically me looking down with pity at the poor people who are lower than me, and then thinking I'm so great because I'm compassionate. None of that. Well, there was that too. The whole thing was conducive, right? Right. Anyway, that was Lama Tarchin. And I had an interview with him, and my wholly skeptical mind. And he told me, because I was saying, why all these instruments and all this noise? When are we going to meditate? All this kind of stuff. And he said, there's so much merit in the accumulation of bodhicitta in those instruments and the tradition and all of this together. He said the birds that are flying over this retreat who hear that bell will not be reborn in the animal realm. And the thing is, you hear these things and you read it in a book, and it just seems like, oh yeah, right, it sounds nice, it's propaganda, it's politics in some sort of way. But you get a taste of it, that for a moment it's true, and then there's been something that's opened to your mind just a little bit to the complete protection sphere that we do. There's been a little crack in it, and it's very, very valuable. Okay. Oh, when did he pass away, Gretch? 2014, 1987, 2014, yeah. Okay. So the Tibetan Book of the Dead. These are remarkable hidden treasures that were discovered by various great lamas. But the important thing is that here you have the Dalai Lama giving this commentary on it, introductory commentary. And this is remarkable in its own right, because in Tibet, the Dalai Lama was part of the Geluk tradition, and they were the ones that ran the government. And some of the more extreme types in the Geluk, were always very critical of the Nyingma. The Nyingma were the original Buddhists in Tibet. They were the first wave of Buddhism that I think is in the 600s, 700s. I can never get it quite straight. But the second wave of Buddhism was in the 1100s or the 1000s, something like that. And that was led largely by Atisha, who figures in many of our practices. And out of that came the Sakyas, which means gray earth, because their main monastery looks like a black and white photo when you look at it. The Kagyu, the secret speech, the esoteric speech, which is our particular thread. And then the Geluks, which are shining virtue. But they're all very, very similar nonetheless, but they're the new schools and then the old schools. So sometimes, especially in the Geluks, because they're particular reformers that took place in the 1300s, sometimes later, some of the extreme Geluk types, it can be a little sectarian, look down at the Nyingma. So here we have the Dalai Lama giving this commentary on a Nyingma text. And I mean, that's just remarkable in its own right. It really isn't when you know the Dalai Lama. It really isn't when you know any of these great teachers. But for him to do this is such an example to the Tibetan people, which is really wonderful, the vastness of it. Anyway, so I think we're going to go through this pretty slow because it's not like a big book, it's just 24 pages. And as you'll see, it's very pithy because he's talking about the high tantra. So again, just to have just a little framework here, the Buddhist path includes sort of three great traditions within it. One is the self-liberation path, and there the motivation is just do no harm, and your motivation is I just want to get out of suffering. That's what it is. It's very kind of individually focused. There's compassion and love and all those things too. But the motivation is self-liberation. Then, and then you have the conventional Mahayana, which is said to take you all the way to Buddhahood, and then the unconventional, the extraordinary Mahayana, which has different names: Vajrayana, Tantrayana, Mantrayana, all sorts of names. The difference is in how you regard yourself, basically. So the conventional Mahayana, which is what the Dalai Lama teaches publicly, is us in our ordinary human body. Here we are. We have created this body. It has all the teachings of karma and rebirth and everything. But the basic practice is it recognizes the limitations. No matter how hard, it's just such a huge assumption that I have that I am me, basically. That I'm this alienated, radically apart from everything else in the world. And so when we do meditation, we're practicing wisdom, all the different degrees of wisdom in the conventional Mahayana. Then after, we're practicing compassion. We go around during the day, we're practicing compassion, because we recognize that that's actually wisdom, but it's as wisdom appears in our dualistic form, our dualistic assumptions. So it's this, sort of two-fisted kind of a practice, wisdom and compassion, like that. And the practice is bodhicitta, the aspirational bodhicitta, training ourselves that we want all motherly sentient beings to be completely self-liberated and attain to Buddhahood, and then engaging or application bodhicitta, which is actually doing something about that. So the example they give is aspiration is like, I want to go to Washington, D.C. You have to have that wish. But application is taking one step in that direction. And those steps are the 6 perfections. So this is called the path of the perfections. and all the perfections that we learn, but they're leading to what? The perfection of wisdom. So this is the path of the perfections, and the idea is that we're sort of going up and up and up and up and up gradually till you get to the perfection of wisdom, the Prajnaparamita. The extraordinary view, the tantric view, is, well, since I believe that we have Buddha nature, because Buddha said that, we just haven't realized it, we're just kind of lost in our distractions and habitual not knowing, that it actually is valid for me to visualize myself as a Buddha. And this is the path of the Vajrayana, which is basically the practice of pure vision. So if you can think about it, here we are with the ordinary Mahayana, we're just ordinary beings. I'm doing virtue, I'm doing all these good things, patience, just all practicing the virtues and staying away from the non-virtues. And there's this path of the accumulation of merit, which is just the inertia, the power that grows up by just being able to do. It's like, I think of it like, some great basketball player going towards the hoop. With all that training that they've had from the time they've been in fourth grade, they get very, very powerful going towards the basket. So we're practicing merit, virtue, and then avoiding and purifying on all the negative things that happen. Everything is turned onto the path. The idea is that we're planting seeds, and because of the truth of cause and effect, we're going to get the effect, which is Buddhahood. But that's the idea. Ordinary being, we're practicing on the path, going the right way. So the Tantra does this radical thing where it says, I'm going to practice the result right now, since that's actually valid. So we visualize ourselves as a Buddha, and there's very, very detailed practices about creation stage where you create yourself as a Buddha, and then dissolution where you rest in the Buddha mind. And so it's like powerful. It's said that Guru Rinpoche, the source of this book, is a manifestation of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni, who appeared in India some 1,000 years later. And why is it's said to be Buddhahood within one lifetime? But it arose because of the degeneration of times. You need especially powerful methods. And why is it powerful? Why? Because instead of me thinking of myself as I ordinarily do, don't have to change anything, think of myself as Frank doing all these things, now with the Tantra, you're going right at your identity. Instead, you are Tara, or you are Vajrakalaya, or you are, whatever particular Buddha you're practicing. And think of that. I mean, the power of identity, we see this in the world all the time. People assume whatever identity, whatever they think they have, and those are fighting words, and it can be very unifying with other people, with other assumed people that share the identity, but it's the source of division too. There's no way out of that. So this is rather remarkable because you're changing your identity, but in a way that is actually valid. So instead of practicing the path of cause, we're practicing the path of result. And this is basically called pure vision. Pure vision means I regard my teacher as being actually a fully enlightened Buddha, not just someone a little bit further along the path, which the rest of the Buddhist world does, or the rest of the Buddhist traditions do. Instead, teacher becomes a fully enlightened Buddha. All your fellow Sangha members, practitioners, or for that matter, even sentient beings, become bodhisattvas, enlightened beings on the way to full Buddhahood. The teachings become the Vajrayana. The time becomes timeless, and the place becomes a pure land rather than just, good old samsara. So these three ways are working, well, these two ways rather, are working with sort of where we're at, but they're both equally profound. It's just different representations of the ultimate truth. So to give you an idea, it's said that the Buddha exists. We exist as Buddhas with three kind of realities, you might say, simultaneously. We divide them for teaching purposes. The ultimate, the Dharmakaya, is like space. I mean, there's nothing you can say about it. It's just kaya means body, and it doesn't mean like physical body, but like a body of truth, you might think. So dharma is truth, the truth body. What is the body of truth? Well, it's like space. It's just so vast you can't grab onto it at all. And yet everything is with space. Space is in everything. In the tiniest thing, there's space. In the biggest universe, there's space. So there's just this vastness that it's just not capable of description. But then there's the Sambhogakaya, which is said to be the body of bliss. That's what it means, Sambhogakaya. And what is this? This is like the first kind of iteration or manifestation of concretization of the Dharmakaya, if you want to think of it like that, although they're both simultaneously happening. So the Sambhogakaya, this bliss nature, is just completely clear, luminous, but aware, completely knowing. And it's said, the example that's given is like it's big cumulus clouds. So here we are on Earth, we look up, we get a sense of the vastness of the sky by being aware of those cumulus clouds. And yet there's something with those clouds that is a lot easier for us to relate to than just this empty space. Because they're beautiful, they have shapes, you can see that they have power, and yet we can't touch them, we can't grab onto them. So that's us when we visualize ourselves as a Buddha. We have that kind of vastness, and yet there's some sort of subtle form there that we can more easily relate to in a practice way from our dualistic perspective. Makes us easy to jump into it, but we're dealing with our own mind, and that's what's so powerful about it. Because the example I've given too is that, forgive me, you've heard this many times, I'm sure, but, I have some sort of responsibility here, right, in an administrative way at White Lotus, and someone walks in the door and they say, you know what, I've got a bunch of gold coins here that I want to make a donation. Yeah, gold bars, right. And right away, I can't help it. My habit, my practice, my negative karma, I'm immediately thinking, wow, what if a place burns down right now? What if they get stolen? What if, maybe we should call the insurance agent right now and raise the limits. You get all these dualistic thoughts that come out of your dualistic situation when you relate to gold. I can't help it. I can't pretend that I'm pure from that gold. It just triggers that. That's the level we're at, the realm of desire. But if I'm visualizing a Buddha with a gold crown, I don't have that attachment, except in a very, very, very subtle way. So nonetheless, that's why one reason it's so skillful, because the mind is sort of freed of its usual hankerings.
How'd you get the money out of the gold bar? That's the other question.
Yeah, there we go. See, it's already multiplying. The world of distractions. So at any rate, that's the Sambhogakaya. And then there's the Nirmanakaya, which is what? It's as the Buddha appeared. It's said to be the deceptive body of the Buddha. So all these exist simultaneously together. And of course, that's one of the wonderful things about, dealing with the deceptive. And I love that term, the deceptive, because again, the Buddhists are so, they're so real and honest, you might say, that even something that's deceptive can be helpful to us. And we don't have to pretend that it's not deceptive. In other words, that it doesn't appear as the whole thing for ordinary people. And this is a great thing. But of course, people have these kinds of, glimmers. You meet a lama, and even if you don't have that idea of the concept of him or she being a Buddha or whatever, you can still, suddenly have sort of very positive mental interactions, whatever, and even like, strange kind of things that is not the point, but it can give people confidence and keep going. But whether you do or not, the important thing is the increase of loving kindness and compassion in your mind, and the calming of the mind and the insight into the mind. All right, so we've got His Holiness 14th Dalai Lama doing this introductory commentary. Let's see, right in the beginning. Yeah, it doesn't have a page number. but it's, you got it, okay. Yeah, you got it. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So here we go. Here is the Tibetan Bardo Turdro. The Tibetan title is The Great Liberation by Hearing in the Intermediate States. So that's very interesting. Yeah.
Translate that into regular people.
The Great Liberation by Hearing in the Intermediate States. Yeah, the intermediate states are the states between dying and being reborn again. And liberation of the mind. Yeah. And by hearing, in the Tantra, it's said that there's liberation by all the senses, by touch, sight, hearing, various methods. Yeah, 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 there is. But it's, that too is a very profound thing if you think about it. Because again, in the Buddhist teachings that all the Buddhist world shares, you kind of stay away from the senses because they tend to trip us up in a way, the products of the senses. Instead, you're meditating, free from the entanglement of the senses. But the Tantra actually uses the senses. Another reason why it's powerful. But the other reason why you could say it has danger, because when you're generating blissful states, people like to stay with a blissful state and they think that's what it's about. But these are all just methods to help beings. That's the thing. Dalai Lama said we don't practice the Tantra in order to come to enlightenment more quickly. We practice the Tantra in order to save sentient beings more quickly. That's a hard one if you think about it. What's in it for me, right? All right, so let's start with the first paragraph. The question of whether or not there exists a continuity of consciousness after death has been an important aspect of philosophical reflection and debate from ancient Indian times to the present. When considering these matters from a Buddhist point of view, however, we have to bear in mind that the understanding of the nature of continuity of consciousness and the understanding of the nature of the I or self are closely interlinked. Therefore, let us first look at what it is that can be said to constitute a person. So this makes perfect sense, really, if you think about it. Why do people get, a fear of death or fear that there's no further existence? Because it's this idea that the I or the self isn't going to continue. And certainly the number one thing is that nobody's looking at the nature of that I. How does it exist? How do we actually exist? Our whole world is this outer projection, and we never quite look at where that's coming from. It's just the way that it is, but this is the number one thing in the Dharma, is looking, investigating that I or that self, especially since if it is the source of fear, is there anything there? They give all sorts of these wonderful examples of that fear is actually like the horns on a rabbit. Sometimes I remember Kempo, somehow he didn't know the word for horn or the name for a word for rabbit, and he was trying to express that basic teaching. It just doesn't exist. The horn isn't there. The fear is there, but it's not based on anything real like we think it is. So at any rate, we have to bear in mind that the understanding of the nature of continuity of consciousness and the understanding of the nature of the I or self are closely interlinked. So let us look at what it is that can be said to constitute a person. Okay. According to Buddhist classical literature, a person can be seen as possessing 5 interrelated aggregates, technically known as the 5 psychophysical aggregates. They're called skandhas in Tibetan. 5 skandhas. And they appear in sort of many, many different ways in the visualizations. But nonetheless, these are the aggregates. He lists them a little bit backwards. Consciousness, and I'll go through these again. The aggregate of form, which includes our physical body and senses. The aggregate of feeling. The aggregate of discrimination. And the aggregate of motivational tendencies. Now, usually these are presented first as form. So, yeah, we have form. And the second one, they say, is a feeling. Feeling here doesn't mean, happy, sad. It means three feelings. One is attraction, and one is, avoidance, going the other direction. And the third one is just neutrality. Then the aggregate of discrimination, usually that's translated as perception. So I guess in Old English, a percept is, something that sort of just appears to the eye. The example that they would use is a bird landing on a wire. It percepts. It has some place where it comes down. I'll talk about it a little bit too. But then the aggregate of motivational tendencies, these are called samskaras, and basically our baggage. What have we carried on from past lifetimes that color our perceptions? And then usually the way they do it, consciousness is the next one. So to give you an idea, form, there is this form. Here we are, we've got this form. Then something arises in the mind, and let's say it's a rhinoceros, but we haven't defined it yet as a rhinoceros. There's an arising in the mind, and there's an immediate either attraction toward or aversion from or just neutrality. It happens just quite spontaneously. But then there's a perception. It means that the mind like plants on something, and that's when you see a rhinoceros. And then the samskaras, our baggage, are, if your form is a rhinoceros, you're going to react differently to a rhino than if you're a human being and your form is a human being, you see a rhino. So we have accumulations, we have tendencies. He calls them discriminations. That's a word used in other ways. So the samskaras is like our baggage. Or I had this wonderful practitioner lady who was a refugee from Poland back in the communist days. Somehow she got out of Poland and found herself at the Rochester Zen Center, but her English was always kind of fun. And she would talk about someone who was like acting out in certain ways. And he says, that person has so much luggage instead of baggage. Anyway, and then based on that, you have consciousness. So you have the consciousness of a rhino and everything that's happening, yeah.
Samskaras. Okay, thank you. Sorry, Dave. Thank you.
Is this samskaras, are they similar or the same as box shots?
Is what?
Box shots.
What are box shots?
Box shots are the residues, the stains, the scents that are left over from previous lives. For instance, if you had an attraction towards, let's say, tennis, and so you played it in the previous lifetime, and then you just saw a tennis racket, and you just liked it. It's that residue, that previous,
Yeah.
usage kind of thing. It just
Yeah, no, it
it's
sounds
the
the same.
scent. It does sound the same. Okay, I was just wondering because I wasn't. I'll have to ask your daughters okay,
I
about
know.
like.
What is that? Is that Tibetan term?
That's what I wanted to know. Is basically is Bakshot the Tibetan or the Sanskrit?
Yeah, I don't know.
Sanskrit.
I don't know.
Okay, but yeah, but Bakshot.
Sounds like it,
Okay,
though.
it sounds like the same
It
thing.
sounds like it.
Sorry about the confusion.
Yeah.
It continues. Okay.
So to give you an idea, there's similes for each of these skandhas. So I'm reading from Edward Conzi. Form is considered the simile as a mass of foam because it's easily crushed, like the dew on a mountain, like the foam on a river, like a bubble on the fountain. Thou art gone and forever. So that's the simile for form in the Buddhist sense is foam. So you see there's impermanence completely permeating that. The feeling, so again, we have this feeling of either attraction or revulsion or neutral. Feeling is compared to a bubble because it bursts soon. Perception is like a mirage because it deludes and imposes upon us. So as soon as that perception is there, there's some sort of limitation. Out of the vastness, we're putting limits on things, perceiving something. The mirage holds out, suggests and promises to be a source of satisfaction for our thirst and longings. but there are no real fountains in it. Likewise, that in which we perceive springs from thirst and desire and is bound to disappoint. The impulses now, so the impulses, those are the samskaras, this is the baggage. Impulses are like the trunk of a plantain tree, because without essence, substance, pith, or marrow. The banana tree is often used as a symbol of frailty. Its sheath-like leaves form a false stem-like structure, and when each leaf is peeled off, nothing remains. Finally, consciousness is termed to be like a magic show, because it deceives and cheats us. So that's the self-liberation view of the five skandhas, and this is what the Dalai Lama is introducing us to, because he's going to build up to this idea of a self and what, if anything, continues. All right, so again, reading the aggregate of consciousness, the aggregate of form, which includes our physical body and senses, the aggregate of feeling, the aggregate of discrimination, or I've been saying perception, and the aggregate of motivational tendencies. And Kanzi says impulses, and we said baggage or samskaras. That is to say, there is our body, the physical world, and our five senses, and there are the various processes of mental activity, our motivational tendencies, our labeling of and discrimination between objects, our feelings, and the underlying awareness or consciousness. So it's sometimes divided into body and mind. You hear it like that too. The form is obviously the body aggregate, and all those other ones are our mind. All right. Among the ancient schools of thought, which accepted the notion of continuity of consciousness, there were several non-Buddhist philosophical schools which regarded the entity, the I or the self, which migrated from existence to existence as being unitary and permanent. They also suggested that this self was autonomous in its relationship to the psychophysical components that constitute a person. In other words, they believed or posited that there is an essence or soul of the person which exists independently from the body and the mind of the person. So this is something I think we're, familiar with, because you have people all the time, although there don't seem to be any detailed teachings that I know of in the theistic traditions. People talk about the soul very easily. And even people who aren't religious, will talk about the soul. I think sometimes it's more kind of a literary or metaphorical statement. But for the eternalists, they believe in a real thing, the soul. And again, what's the idea? Well, in Hinduism, for instance, which believes in a soul, though they call it the Atman, yeah, it's a word actually that we know, like Gandhi's title was Mahatman, Maha, great, Atman, Mahatman, the great soul, the great self, whatever. So in rebirth, reincarnation, more accurately in the Hindu traditions, the idea of this Atman, this soul, is reincarnated, carne being body or flesh, but rebodified. It's going like bouncing from body to body to body, life after life after life. The Buddhist idea, what you see here, is, I think, a step subtler, where rather than there be some entity like a soul that's reincarnating, instead there's a dynamic process. The image that's given is a seal, like in the seal of a king putting his seal on a stamp. You've got this stamp and you've got hot wax, and this image goes from the stamp to the wax. Now the question is, what passed over? I mean, nothing. But at the same time, something did. The other example is a flame going from candle to candle. Again, the flame that's passed over is completely different from the flame that was there, and yet it's the same thing too. So it's this middle way understanding between existing and non-existing, but rather it's dynamic. and so the Buddhists typically say rebirth rather than reincarnation. But as we'll see, this was, well, I think we came across in the previous book of what a radical idea it was when the Buddha of his time suddenly gave the no soul teaching on Atman. You know, it's really radical to his day, and in that sense, it's radical to us too. But nonetheless, they says there's in the glossary there's a description of the 5 psychophysical aggregates, but I don't think I was able to find it in the glossary. So if anybody can, let me know. But I'll try to find it another time. That's why I read it out of Kanzi, because I couldn't find it in this book. No. I meant out in this book. Yeah, in the book. That's why I read it out of Kanzi, because I knew he had a discussion of it too. Let me just see if I can find it under 5. 5 aggregates. Here we go. Panchaskanda. Well, he just lists them, and there's no discussion of them. Okay. Page 2, or since we're in the introductory commentary, page 16 in Roman numerals. However, Dalai Lama continuing, however, Buddhist philosophy does not accept the existence of such an independent, autonomous entity. In the Buddhist view, the self or the person is understood in terms of dynamic, interdependent relationship of both mental and physical attributes. That is to say, the psychophysical components which constitute a person. In other words, our sense of self can, upon examination, be seen as a complex flow of mental and physical events, clustered in clearly identifiable patterns, including our physical features, our instincts, our emotions, our attitudes, etc., continuing through time. Further, according to Prasangika Madhyamaka philosophy, which has become the prevailing philosophical view of Tibetan Buddhism, this sense of self is simply a mental construct, a mere label given to this cluster of dependently arising mental and physical events in dependence on their continuity. That's such a mind-boggling thing. The Prasangika Madhyamaka, again, going back to ancient India, the great Buddhist philosophers have, classified the different philosophical views that arose in the Sangha as they were teaching. Again, an attempt to sort of conceptualize things so that it can be helpful to our conceptual mind. We spoke last week a little bit about the Yogacara. That's again, these different kind of philosophical ones. Typically, people, the scholars in our tradition, like Kempo, would say that the Yogacara, very profound, third turning of the wheel, Buddha nature teachings, complete emptiness, complete understanding of the self-liberation, everything profound. But a step more subtle is the Madhyamaka. Madhyamaka basically means middle way. And then in the Madhyamaka, that in turn has 2 different kind of views within it. One is the Svatantrika Madhyamaka. There's a quiz at the end of the day. And then the Prasangika Madhyamaka. The Sakya school holds on to the Svatantrika Madhyamaka, whereas the Nyingma, us, the Kagyu, the Geluks, all are holders of the Prasangika Madhyamaka. So very, very subtle differences. We don't really need to worry about it, but just so you know, this is considered to be the highest philosophical point of view. So that the self is basically a notation. We give this a name, but that's all there is to it, is really the name. Our ordinary understanding that's really the only reality to our ordinary understanding is just simply the name. because in its existence, it is this fantastic, dynamic, through this continuity of time. I mean, it's vast. We don't realize our own vastness. In fact, if I can say, I think it's all right. You know, the funny thing is about us is that we fear our own vastness. We're always looking for something solid that we can depend on, that we can grab onto. It's the nature of our self-grasping habit that we've developed over lifetimes. We'll see if we get to this. I don't know if he talks about it in the commentary. I don't think he does. But in the actual teachings in the Book of the Dead, you know, preparing you for what to expect, what to look for, how to use each kind of occasion that arises. It's said that there are, at one point, you're like wandering, and there are lights, and there are dull lights and bright lights. And you want to go towards the bright light, but yet people tend to get a little afraid of the bright light, and they want to go to something that's kind of comforting. Those dull lights are the six realms. You know, you end up as a human, you end up as a sensual god, a fighting god, an animal, a hungry ghost, or even, sadly, a hell being. The length of which that existence depends on one's karma, so it's not quite deterministic. But nonetheless, the fact that we're afraid of our own brightness, it's such a tremendously positive view, nonetheless. Okay, now, when we look at this interdependence of mental and physical constituents from the perspective of highest yoga tantra, all right, there are two concepts of a person. So first of all, this term of highest yoga tantra. The Sakyas, all the new traditions classify these tantric teachings in four ways. The Nyingma classifies them in 6 different ways. It doesn't really matter. It's just the two highest in the Nyingma are just combined basically in the new traditions. But here they're talking about the highest. What does that mean, the highest? Well, they're, again, progressively more and more subtle in your understanding. The lower tantras, for instance, there's Yoga Tantra, there's Upa Tantra, there's Charya Tantra, and then there's the highest Yoga Tantra, Uttara Tantra. But at any rate, what does this mean? Well, the Yoga Tantra, yoga is union, right? So the idea of Yoga Tantra is that we're uniting with our true nature, uniting with the Buddha, but the Buddha is visualized as being outside of you. Because right now we see everything as being outside of us. So it's working with that, and it's a little easier to step into. You know, you can visualize the Buddha outside and in front of you, and then you're making all sorts of ritual activities. You have to be changing your clothes 6 times a day, only eating out of copper vessels, all this outer kind of purificatory practices. So that's the Yoga Tantra. Then there's Upa. I can never remember what Upa means, but then what happens? Well, the Buddha now is over your head. And I don't know, I've experienced this. I don't know if it's like this for people, can be wildly different. But I found it harder to visualize a Buddha over my head than it was to visualize a Buddha out in front. And I'm not a good visualizer for starters. But still, the idea of even just feeling that there's a Buddha out there was easier than over my head. So it's getting a little bit closer to you, so to speak. And then with the so Yoga Tantra, Upa Tantra, Charya Tantra. Now the Charya Tantra, I think the Buddha blends with you for the first time, but they're still considered the lower tantras. They're very dependent on outer activity, ritual activity, and things like this. But then with the higher Tantra, you become the Buddha. So most of the practices that we're doing here are higher tantric practices. And now you're visualizing yourself as the Buddha and then doing all these activities and all these things. Uttara Tantra Tantra. That's the highest Yoga Tantra. Uttara means highest, beyond. Yeah. In the Nyingma, again, there's a classification of Maha Yoga Tantra. Great yoga, great unification. So our Vajrakalaya practice is one of those. And then there's, above that, there's Anu Yoga Tantra, which is the veins and channels and all those internal energies. Yeah, 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 the Tiglis. So the result of Maha Yoga is you realize the identity of form and emptiness. And the result of the Anu Yoga practice is you realize the unity of emptiness and bliss. And then above that, there's Ati Yoga, the highest yoga. So like Lama Tarchan's the place where I did that first retreat, Ati Ling, place of the highest understanding, Ati. Ling is a place. Ati Yoga is also Dzogchen. And they're the union of emptiness and awareness. So again, just a little more gradation, but all of that is within the highest yoga tantra in the Kagyu or the Geluk or the Sakya. And there it's divided between Father Tantra, which emphasizes method, and Mother Tantras, which emphasize wisdom. So a little bit more subtle, but they're all still within that highest yoga tantra. So that's what he's talking about here anyway, the highest practices. Okay, so when we look at this interdependence of mental and physical constituents from the perspective of highest yoga tantra, there are two concepts of a person. One is the temporary person or self, that is as we exist at this moment. And this is labeled on the basis of our coarse or gross physical body and conditioned mind. And at the same time, there is a subtle person or self, which is designated in dependence on a subtle body and subtle mind. This subtle body and subtle mind are seen as a single entity that has two facets. The aspect which has the quality of awareness, which can reflect and has the power of cognition, is the subtle mind. Simultaneously, there is its energy, the force that activates the mind towards its object. This is the subtle body or subtle wind. These two inextricably conjoined qualities are regarded in highest Yoga Tantra as the ultimate nature of a person and are identified as Buddha nature, the actual or essential nature of mind. Wow. So as I say, this is rather pithy, this teaching. This is not going to be easy, and we're going to go slow with it for that reason. But leave it here tonight, just establishing the idea that why is this powerful? Why is the Tantra, why do they teach the Tantra? Because although it's rare, it's said to be especially efficacious in degenerate times when people confuse virtue as being non-virtue, non-virtue as being virtuous, and when the afflictive emotions, which cause our negative karma, are rough. They're just very powerful. So why? Because it uses. So again, instead of getting away, trying to do away with, oh, I don't have a self. You know, I sometimes see this, experience some of this at Western Buddhist centers where you think that, I'm going to act as if I don't have an ego. Well, no, you can't do that. You believe deeply you have an ego. It's already there. That's right. That's ego in itself. Look at my ego. I'm so great. I'm doing away with my ego. It's all ego. It's like, that's how tricky the situation we're in. Even the desire to get rid of desire is desire. So what are we going to do in that? It looks impossible. This is why the Tantra, one reason that it's so powerful, because one, it's dealing with identity itself, which is where we live, but also because it uses our sense of self. But instead of this gross self that's banging around and doing all the stuff that we do, we suddenly start developing confidence in a subtle self, which is what? Well, one, the mind, which is this awareness and cognition. So that's extremely positive. It's not some sort of unconscious state that if I can just stop my mind from working, I'm going to be happy. You know, that wrong kind of idea of meditation. Instead, it's all right to be aware. That's what we're trying to do. But then what's the body? Well, the subtle body are the winds. In Tibetan, lung, in Sanskrit, prana. So we can manipulate, you'll see, those winds. I think of it sometimes like genetic surgery. You know, it's just so amazing some of the stuff they can do by going very deep and changing some little thing. And the next thing you know, you got someone who, I don't know what, neurological disease, but suddenly it's gone. I mean, just amazing. This is like that on a spiritual level. You're going right down to the core. Lama Tarchin said it's like there's a mountain. And in that mountain, there's a lake. Our samsaric existence, our body, is like this mountain. And it's very solid and it's big and it holds this lake of suffering. And he said what happens is if you get the lung, the winds, into the central channel of your subtle body, the mountain goes away. There's no support for the lake, suffering, gone. And that is the Sambhogakaya. It's just bliss. And we can ride that bliss all the way to Buddhahood. So, very fantastical, but I love reading this because the Dalai Lama is not some sort of lunatic or some sort of person just believing in just wild fancies. Yes, I think I'm not sure if they knew what they were doing. Well, they did when they gave him the Nobel Peace Prize, but I don't think they realized. They didn't ask him for teachings on the Bardo. That was being political. All right, so we'll stop there. First, any questions before we just dedicate tonight? Anything? Anybody? I know it's very heady stuff, but very liberating.
Made me think of Nietzsche during the description of label. Nietzsche said, if you label me, you negate.
You want this key?
You want me to have it.
Yeah, do.
There you go. Yeah.
Do.
Oh, so it reminded me of Nietzsche saying, if you label me, you negate me.
Oh,
So-
interesting. Yeah.
Right? Now, I know he's not Buddhist, but it sounded like it was a similar thing that you were saying, because
Yeah, I don't know, really anything about philosophy or that really at all. But what I've noticed is so many, valid attempts, people in the Western traditions trying to understand and actually getting little angles of it. What blows me away by the Tibetans, it's not Tibetans, it's Buddhism, is the comprehensiveness and the way it all hangs together. And you actually experience this in the practices too, because some little phrase that you've just been chanting over and never really paying attention to, suddenly it connects to something else in your conceptual understanding. And of course it can too, deeper in an experiential way. And so there's this, it's like the opposite of a negative spiral. It's just like better and better and better and better. Not that there aren't purifications and difficulties that happen. But what happens is that faith goes from being deeper, until eventually it's unalterable faith. It means that no matter what happens, it doesn't destroy your belief in Buddha nature and the efficacy of the Dharmic path. Instead, you start to see these things as purification, and because you see the source, that's tremendously strengthening. All right, let's see if I can find, I was looking for a particular, anything else? Otherwise, we'll dedicate for tonight. Okay? All right. We dedicate the merit from this evening to all motherly sentient beings. May each and every one of us come to understand our true nature, see the true nature of others, the Buddha nature of all. Never stop until every last one is free. Svaha. Okay. Yeah, I'm excited about this. But also I realize, I guess it's because I'm getting older and people start dying. Suddenly the teachings on death sound, maybe we should be paying attention to this. Yeah, right.
Frank,
Yeah.
being that I was a weirdo kid, I've been looking at the Tibetan Book of the Dead since I was like 9.
Mm-hmm.
I had a whole bunch of New Agey wives of history.
Right.
And just like they were taking rebirthing classes and things like that. Is this an accurate one? Because the one we had wasn't like so this is the real version.
That's the real thing. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I was only
Yeah, this is the real one. Also, somewhere along here, we'll be reading from Chogyam Trungpa's introduction to the first translation of the Book of Dead. Was not all of it. This is the first complete translation. There are several other parts of it that have been first. First was one by Evan Wentz, who was some British guy, but back in like 1920s that he translated it. And then there's a more modern one that I very much like by Francesca Fremantle, and that has an introduction by Chogyam Trungpa, which is really wonderful. It's highly psychological, but it's for people to get understanding, like, oh my goodness, this is really valuable because you see your own psychology that you can use. So we'll be reading that too in the course of this as a supplement to this. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Amazing. Oh my gosh. Especially the thing that I found really interesting, because Steph and I lived in Boulder for a long time. And just the vernacular he uses, what we think is common. We get all used to these terms, You're like, oh, you're a Christian, you're a genuflecting. You get used to it. He says it in such a different way that it completely solidifies the understanding.
Yeah, he had great control of the English language. It was something. His previous lifetimes, he had 13 lifetimes, 13 previous lifetimes living in a cave. And then here he is, a little boy, in a Tibetan monastery before the Chinese invasion, and he was very wild. And that's some of the tulkus are said to be like that. Garbo Rinpoche too. They're very kind of a lot of energy and kind of untamable when they're young. And he said that he was always resisting. Chogyam Trungpa said always resisting his teachers and just doing all sorts of making trouble for other little kids and monks and stuff. And then one day it just turned around for him, and he suddenly got interested in learning. And he said he just couldn't get enough. He was just absorbing. Kind of to me, it sounds like Mozart or something, where it's just like, where is this coming from? But it's like, and after those 13 years in a cave, I mean, he was such like an aficionado of wine, for instance. So, we do a soak offering here, and we're drinking a little grape juice, and what are the Protestants and the Tibetan Buddhists, I don't know, and having our little soak offering. And he would have big soak offerings in Boulder. And people would bring in offerings. And of course, they'd bring in wine, because that's actually part of a soak offering. That isn't any kind of generation or that. And but he would have the guy come up, and he'd be examining the vintage, And I had read one story of one of his students who he was going to teach on the perfection of wisdom, and everybody was excited about this because they had been leading up to it. Going the 6 perfections. Tonight was the perfection of wisdom he was going to teach. Everyone was all revved up, and they're all sitting there waiting for him to come. He comes in an hour late, and he was drunk. And everybody was like, what the hell? And he sat down, and then the person who was there testifying, he gave this completely clear, insightful teaching. I don't know, Gretchen and I went to one Shalpa Tenzin, the Nyingma Lama, who was just sort of coming through town, I guess, and we brought him here, and he gave a talk at the just for a weekend, and he gave a talk at Writers and Books, and he was brand new to America, a young kind of brilliant kind of Lama, and but he's giving his talk, and he stops his talk. He's all done. It's time for question and answers. Everyone's a little, shy, not talking, but he thought he'd break the ice, I guess, and he talked to one woman in the front, and he said, "You're fat," which is like a praise in India or Tibet. It's like you're doing well. You're like rich. You're wearing Gucci. That's good. And I just thought, you got to do this differently out here. We never saw her again. That's right. But anyway, he had some sort of New Year's thing that he invited Gretchen and I to, and we went. And he said, you do this mantra, you won't get drunk. And I don't know if I was just fooling myself, but it seemed to be really true. I was drinking the wine, and I didn't have any effect. But that's not why you practice.
It's like a super liver. I have to say, every time I drank anything, it was to get drunk.
Sometimes that is the goal.
That's right. That's right. All right. Okay. See you next time.
It's funny though, because I never really was into, because Naropans are all intense, you know, you're going down to the Naropa and they're all just, you know, just weirdos running around. And I'm one of them, of course. We go by. All of our friends were, you know, but it's just like all the students, and I first got into, I didn't get the, because